On the stand right now, David Whitley. He's one of the lead investigators who looked into this bizarre employment wife swap official corruption case in North Carolina, where a former defense attorney who ran for district attorney and won the election is now accused of swapping wives, employment-wise, with a neighboring district attorney. The goal was so that each of the men would earn additional income by employing one another's wives. However, the wife that was employed by this defendant, Wallace Bradsher, was accused of going to nursing school when she was really pulling down a full-time salary. And he's basically going over the investigative process here. We're going to go back into testimony now. When we come back, Nicole DeBorde will be here from Houston, Texas, to help break down this case. And welcome back, everybody. We're going to take a quick pause during this pause in testimony to bring in Nicole DeBorde. She's joining us from Houston, Texas. Nicole, good to see you again.
Great to see you.
Okay, so this is one of the key investigators who is digging into this situation. And look, you've got an official corruption trial in North Carolina where you've got two elected prosecutors who used to be defense attorneys. They both win election at different times, and they cook up this scheme, according to the state's theory of the case, to basically hire one another's wives in order to keep more money rolling in for themselves. One of the prosecutors, Craig Blitzer, spoke with this investigator, and we're untangling that discussion right now. But it sounds to me that it was Craig Blitzer and his wife, Cindy, who were really worried about not making enough money. I don't recall any witness in this case saying that the defendant himself, Wallace Bradsher, was the one who was really worried about his finances here. Do you see this the way I see it?
I do see it the way you see it. You know, the problem is that these are all considerations these gentlemen should have taken into account before they ran for office. It's a public service job. It's not a get-rich-quick job. And this is something they should have known about well in advance to plan for budgeting. And bringing in people to put on a sort of a ghost payroll isn't the solution. And, you know, I have a feeling that the sentencing is going to be tough on these. This is an outrageous circumstance, unfortunately.
Look, I agree. I'm trying to figure out exactly who is steering the bus here. And it sounds, if we're to trust the Blitzer's testimony, that they were the ones really driving the bus here out of a perceived financial need. But I can see, listening to this investigator, why they really focused in on the defendant, because he was the one that was supervising Cindy Blitzer, and apparently he was the one who had the final say over her going to school while she was getting paid. So I can see why they focused in the way they did.
Sure. You know, I mean, and the bottom line is this couldn't have happened if he didn't agree. And at some point, you have to take responsibility for knowing what your employees are up to. And it sounds like this went on for a while. So I have to agree with you. It does sound like he wasn't the one driving the bus, but at the end of the day, he is going to be responsible, especially in the court. Well, he is responsible in the court's eyes, and he's going to pay with the sentence that he's about to be dealt.
Yeah, you know, to what degree, though? You've got a possibility of, 18 potential years in prison for ultimately what the other guy's wife was doing, and presumably benefiting from more concretely than this own defendant. Look, folks, this is a complicated case. We're going to get back to this testimony. This is a really key witness, the lead investigator who is tasked with unraveling this really complicated web. The judge calling about an hour-and-a-half lunch break in the Wallace Bradsher case out of North Carolina. This case involves a series of counties in north-central North Carolina, but it's being heard in Raleigh because that's where the state agency sits, which poured the money out that is in question in this case. Nicole DeBorde is with us from Houston, Texas. She's been monitoring the case from down there. Nicole, look, official corruption here. You've got some interesting testimony that's really starting to loop the state's theory of the case back together here as to exactly why the state wants to really zone in on Wallace Bradsher and not necessarily the Blitzers here.
Exactly. I think once you start hearing things about threatening to fire employees because they might be snitching, you have big trouble if you're the defense.
Yes, I agree. And, you know, initially I was sitting through this case, and look, my mind changes as the testimony continues here. I was initially sitting here saying, okay, why are they going after this guy? You know, he's the supervisor, I get it, but the Blitzers were the ones that all the testimony seems to surround as having raised this issue of a financial need. It sounds almost like what Wallace Bradsher should have done is said, well, too bad, so sad. You're going to have to figure that out on yourself, on your own, for yourselves, and we wouldn't even be sitting here having a trial.
Exactly. I mean, this is entirely a punishment case, clearly, and the information that the state is bringing in at this point is very detail-oriented, and it's important that they go through these sort of what look like maybe boring steps to explain how all these things are connected, because every now and again you get a real big reason to understand why all of these defendants knew exactly what was going on and why they should be held responsible.
Yes, this is starting to become a tighter case for the state. So, look, we're going to talk a lot more about the Wallace Bradsher case when we continue. It looks like it's going to be a lengthy lunch break in that case. We've got plenty of other things to talk about, including the Casey Anthony case. But first, before we get to all of that, let's get you caught up on the top crime stories of the day. You know, all sorts of interesting things to discuss in the news. You've got this Hilton case, you know, and another case that you can sort of tie under the umbrella of affluenza. You've got the affluenza teen, that's in the news. His mother's getting in legal trouble. So, you know, let's try to talk about a little bit of both of them here. The Hilton case, you know, look, is this a case, Nicole, in your opinion, where the punishment should have been harsher, or is that a run-of-the-mill punishment for that crime?
It's a fairly run-of-the-mill punishment for that crime. I mean, what you're trying to do is make sure that somebody who has an addiction problem and who is having some sort of mental health problems, which it certainly appears that he is having, is doing everything they can to try to get back to a stable place where they don't go outside the lines and don't commit crimes. And obviously, whatever they're doing right now on that probation isn't fully working. And that happens. Sometimes there's slippage. Sometimes some of the people that are on probation who have addictions sort of slide back and need to be monitored more tightly. And that may be what's going on right now. You know,
no contact is basically the order, but you know, it leads one to wonder, why is a member of the Hilton family stealing a car? It certainly probably wasn't need, that, you know, no necessity for transportation there. I guess that's the next imponderable here.
I'm not sure anyone needs a Bentley, but if you're going to go big, right?
Or it'll just get you in more trouble, I guess.
Exactly.
I mean, you know, you could always buy one for us as a corporate vehicle here at Law&Crime. You know, we could accept gifts from guests. You could send one our way.
I'm happy to test drive one if anybody wants to send one, that's for sure.
Yeah, you know, one of the other things in the news is you've got this affluenza teen. You remember that big case where somebody tried to get out of trouble by saying that they were influenced by so-called affluenza being in too much prosperity. Well, that teen's mother is in trouble on apparently some kind of a positive test for methamphetamine. It's in the news because of that phrase affluenza. So is the danger here that if you're a defense attorney, maybe you shouldn't try to coin one of these phrases to get to the jury because it'll follow the defendant's family forever?
Well, I think that's certainly true. In this particular case, I don't know that the defense attorney actually knew that word was going to come out of his expert's mouth. It did. And here we are all these years later with these people who are resurfacing because they have access to basically whatever strikes their fancy. I think seeing this mother in this situation again gives us a pretty good understanding of what's going on in that household and how this kid ended up in the situation that he's in. And it's tragic. She needs obviously more help than she's getting.
Yeah, you know, all sorts of interesting things in the news today. It's why we're bringing it up to speed. You can always check lawandcrime.com for all of the latest headlines in the cases and interesting legal scenarios, I guess you could say, that we're covering here. I want to switch back now and talk about the case we're covering live here on the Law and Crime Network. That's the Wallace Bradsher case. You've got an official corruption case with a lot of separate charges here. There are many moving parts of this, Nicole. And I've been saying all along, I'm trying to figure out who is really driving the bus here. You have the defendant, Wallace Bradsher, who was hiring his wife. And his initial explanation for it is, look, I was running a very successful private practice. My wife was part of the team. The local prosecutor was botching case after case after case. Everything was falling apart in my community. So I decided to run for office with the promise that I was going to bring my team into the office and basically start kicking butt. So he did that, and he's saying that he asked initially if he could hire his own wife, and he was told yes, he could, because as a constitutional officer, in other words, as an elected official whose position is outlined in the actual state constitution, that as a constitutional officer, the State Ethics Act somehow didn't apply to him the way it would apply to an average hiring manager. That, in other words, because the voters are rubber stamping his promise to bring his wife into the situation, therefore he can't get in trouble for it. And apparently it went on like that for about 4 years. Does that alone sound like sound legal reasoning, or does that sound suspicious from the get-go?
It sounds a little suspicious from the get-go. I mean, when you're going to serve in public office, one of the first things that ought to be crystal clear to you is that the rules that everybody else has to follow, that you're enforcing, apply to you also. And so when you start trying to make end runs around the rules before you even take a seat in your new office, you've got big problems.
Well, I guess that, you know, in this rural county, his defense is in part, who else was I going to hire? She was the best one around. That's why we won so many cases as a defense team, and he said in his opening statement that my wife was a critical part of that. So he had his wife working for him. Well, then when the neighboring DA decided to try to do it, then the ethics authorities came down, and it sent the whole thing into haywire. And I've been asking, okay, who was driving the bus here? Was it the blitzers, or was it Wallace Bradsher, who was then employing one of the blitzers while the other blitzer was the neighboring prosecutor? They're trading all these conflict cases back and forth. You know, if one had a conflict of interest and legally couldn't prosecute a case, he was handing it over to the neighboring prosecutor. And you know, what's the phrase, what a tangled web we weave when we practice to deceive? You know, is that what's going on here?
You know, it's hard to say. It is really good when the DA's offices have very good relationships with their neighboring DAs, because there are cases that one DA can't handle. And you can either appoint a special prosecutor, or you can send a case to a county where there's already an operation in place who has the funds and the resources to handle a case. So that's not necessarily a bad thing. And really, quite frankly, having a spouse work at the office doesn't seem like such a bad thing either, unless it's specifically against your state's ethic rules. To me, this situation is the perfect example of sometimes the cover-up is worse than the lie itself. And what we're hearing from the witness who's on the stand today is that there were threats to employees who might, quote unquote, be snitching about the circumstance. When you are so aware that what you're doing is wrong, that you start threatening potential employees for telling someone that you're doing it, it's time to really reevaluate what it is you're up to.
Yeah, look, let's dial back and listen to some of the testimony of that neighboring prosecutor. Okay, remember that Wallace Bradsher is the guy who's in the defendant's chair here. Sort of ironic, because he used to be a defense attorney and he used to be a prosecutor, but now he's in the defendant's chair. I guess he's sat in pretty much every chair in the courtroom at this point. But the neighboring prosecutor was Craig Blitzer. He testified in this case. He was charged. He copped a plea, and apparently he's not really going to be punished in any criminal sense in reality. I mean, he copped to the charge, but apparently they're really not going to incarcerate him in any meaningful term in return for his testimony. He did give up his law license. He's working now as a pilot. He was on the witness stand, so let's listen to some of what he had to say. Attorney Nicole DeBorde is on the line with us yet again from Houston, Texas. She's been with us throughout the afternoon here. Nicole, good to see you again. Affluenza teen back in the headlines. We talked about this a couple of minutes ago. But look, what do we make of this? I mean, is this family just going to be under scrutiny forever every time they, you know, cross without waiting for the little light of the pedestrian giving them permission? Is that going to now forever be attached to this case? Now the mother under scrutiny because basically, you know, the son had this little buzzword used in his trial.
You know, I think that they're definitely going to be under scrutiny, at least for as long as they're under court supervision. And that's just a reality for anybody who's on any kind of probation with the court. Court has the duty to monitor these people and make sure that they're not slipping out of control. And if she's testing positive for methamphetamines, she needs some more intensive supervision, or at least something to help her get herself back under control. You know, whether that amounts ultimately to them being dinged in the public eye every time they do some small thing, maybe, maybe not, but if you are going to be using meth while you're on probation, you can expect some media attention, I would expect.
Well, yeah, and you know, I also don't want to make light of the original charge here, because you got 4 people killed in that original wreck, a 16-year-old making all sorts of decisions, which ultimately, you know, if we're to believe the prosecution theory of it, killed those people. You know, you got people fleeing to Mexico, coming back, psychologists blaming this on being in an affluent community and therefore thinking at age 16 that you can get away with pretty much anything. And look, I mean, the long arm of the law is going to catch up with you at some point. Maybe that's the ultimate lesson here.
Absolutely. I mean, and I think there are probably more than a few 16-year-olds that think they can kind of just walk through life without consequence. And unfortunately, this young person had very, very little guidance, or we can now see what kind of guidance he had in the home. And it led to him failing to make proper judgments and in the death of 4 human beings. It's a terrible case, and they need to be supervised. His mother needs supervision and addiction treatment, apparently, and the courts are going to be looking at this closely until they are completely done with their supervision.
And just to draw the link again, the reason the mother's under supervision is because she's the one in the original case that killed 4 who allegedly helped the son flee to Mexico. So that's why she's underneath the judge's thumb right now.
That's exactly right. They use their substantial resources. The parents in this case, instead of helping their son learn how to take responsibility, mom has him do a hair dye and cut and sneaks him off to Mexico, where he's in hiding for a while before he's finally caught and brought back to the United States. This is not the kind of parenting the court was hoping to see. It certainly didn't help this young man in his case and in his sentencing, and now she's got her own problems.
Well, it's the sort of case that draws headlines, and then, of course, people like to see how the courts are going to mete out their punishment. That's what's going on here. So, look, we're going to dial back to the Wallace Bradsher case here on Law and Crime. This is an official corruption case out of North Central North Carolina. The accusation is that one district attorney cooked up a scheme with a neighboring district attorney to hire one another's wives, have more money rolling in for themselves, and that one of the wives wasn't working. She was really going to nursing school. Not the husband of the woman who was not working is the subject of this instant case. He had a separate case, basically pleaded out, but the one who is really in trouble is not the one who was benefiting from getting paid and not working. The one who's in trouble was her supervisor. He's the guy who's on trial now, Wallace Bradsher, but the husband of the woman accused of basically not working while she was getting paid was on the witness stand in this case. He's a cooperating witness after entering a plea of his own. He was on the witness stand. I want to go back to some of his testimony as we wait for court to resume.
Okay.
There were a lot of names getting kicked around in this case. You've got Tyler Henderson. He was another witness on the stand. Look, Nicole DeBorde, attorney in Houston, Texas, still here with us breaking this down. We are listening to all these names, and we had the investigator on the stand earlier, and he's basically saying, look, I had to go through and try to cut an investigative path or swath through all of these folks who work in this small office. They all know one another relatively well, presumably. They're all back and forth with the neighboring DA's office on conflict cases. So basically, you know, the state had to try to figure out a way to get into this, and everybody's talking about it. It winds up in the local paper. This had to be a nightmare for the investigators who were trying to get to the bottom of exactly who was doing what.
I think that's exactly right. And I'm sure it was totally disappointing, too, because these people are working for law enforcement together, and they're all hoping that the people that they're working with are doing the right thing. And this is a rather complicated tale to explain why these two people who are responsible for these two state agencies or county agencies, for lack of a better way to describe it, are putting people on their payroll who don't belong there, and some of whom aren't even working.
Yeah, I mean, look, it doesn't sound good. I'm wondering whether or not the jurors are believing the defendant's story less and less as this investigation continues, because, you know, at first I was willing to give him the benefit of the doubt. Of course, he's innocent until proven guilty, so I think that it's not strange for me to look at these cases that way. And at first he had a relatively rational explanation for at least some of this. He's saying, okay, look, my wife was working for me in private practice. I brought her with her to the DA's office when I was elected. We worked 4 years together. Nobody rose a stink about it. There was no issue. There were no complaints. We won a ton of cases. We were way more successful than the previous prosecutor. And then when I talked with my neighboring prosecutor, this guy whose testimony we're reviewing, Craig Blitzer, then that's when everything started to blow up. And by the way, it happened when my right-hand man had a serious medical complication, wound up partially paralyzed. I'm trying to fill in with him. And he's kind of painting the picture that Cindy Blitzer was falling through the cracks, which isn't a good situation, but it's at least kind of sort of excusable. Now, with some of the testimony we've heard over the last couple of days, it sounds more accurately, if we're to believe these witnesses, that this defendant deliberately wanted it to look like she was falling through the cracks because he was doing a favor for his buddy, the county over, and by the way, his own wife would still keep working.
Exactly. And one of the things that he just said in testimony that we just heard was super alarming. And I would imagine his attorneys weren't real happy to hear it. But he was describing this position that he was offering was providing security. And when Blitzer was no longer working, or when there was nobody working in the position that he was trying to fill comparatively, there was no longer any security. What do you mean by that? You know, the more these people talk, the more they talk themselves into a corner. This is a defense attorney's nightmare.
Well, he's defending himself, you know. I mean,
right.
He used to be a defense attorney, so now he's defending himself. What do you think of that thing just as a threshold? I mean, we see defendants defending themselves, but this is probably the first time, truth is stranger than fiction, where I've ever seen a former defense attorney who then was a prosecutor then defend himself in a criminal case.
This is exactly why you don't do that. He completely does not have a reasonable view of the big picture here because he is so involved in it. He can't tell whether what's coming out of his mouth and what he's thinking is reasonable at this point and how it sounds because he's the one saying it. He doesn't have anybody to moderate his strategies. He doesn't have anybody to talk with about whether or not the information that he's providing is something that should be provided or whether it's objectionable. This is just a disaster. It's not a good circumstance for him. And, you know, what do they say? An attorney who defends himself has a fool for a client. And this is an example.
I was waiting for that one to come out of someone's lips, and it was you, Nicole DeBorde from Houston, Texas, who decided to use the euphemism. And look, we want to continue listening to Craig Blitzer's testimony. We'll be back with more analysis of this with Nicole in a little bit. This is an interesting case out of North Carolina, an official corruption case. 2 former elected district attorneys in that courtroom, one sitting in the defendant's chair, the other one sitting on the witness stand, one, the defendant now, cross-examining who was alleged by the prosecutors in this case to have been a co-conspirator. I don't know as though I've seen anything like this before. As I said before, truth is a little bit stranger than fiction. Nicole, have you ever seen this?
This is so bizarre. I mean, as it goes on, it gets stranger and stranger. It doesn't get better. It's really pretty unbelievable. And neither of these guys are helping themselves. This whole thing just keeps getting worse and worse.
In what sense?
The more he talks on the stand, the worse both of their positions look. I think that Blitzer seems to be asking these questions in hopes that he's going to clear something up. The more questions he asks, the bigger the hole is that the witness is digging himself into for both of them. It's not I'm not sure what the strategy is here, but whatever it is, it's not working.
Well, the strategy is that they're going to blame it all on one another and say, well, you know, yeah, I was involved, but to a minimal degree, and you should really be throwing the book at the other guy. That's what it is. I guess it's like a gentleman's, you know, duel, only without weapons or gloves being taken off and slapped across the other one's cheeks. It's just a war that's being fought with polite words, I guess, in this courtroom.
Exactly. I'm not sure either of these guys are coming off looking like gentlemen. They're looking like guys that have their hands in the taxpayers' wallets. So, you know, it's the longer these witnesses talk to each other, and really this attorney is a witness. He's sitting there from counsel table, basically testifying with questions he's asking. And if he had a lawyer, I'm quite certain whoever that lawyer would be shutting him down many questions ago.
You know, I've wondered about that, too. You know, we've had a few objections here, but not many. And part of it is my wondering whether the strategy here in this trial is to just kind of let everybody hang themselves up on the witness stand and not really derail the flow of it with a lot of objections.
It seems like it. You know, I think there's so much bizarre information coming in to the record here that I'm not sure if he objected to everything that was objectionable coming out of these people's mouths, I'm not sure we'd ever get done with this trial. And at some point, I'm sure the prosecutor just must be wondering whether or not it's helpful to just let him keep on drawing out this rope. It's not a helpful situation for the defense, so why not let them carry on? Yeah,
so, you know, you got the witness on the stand. He's a cooperating witness, but he entered a plea to one charge, and a lot of people are saying he's really not going to get much of a punishment for it. That was discussed. You know, there's all these prayers and whatnot as part of the local procedural rules there, and he may basically not get incarcerated even though there was a plea. Maybe the prosecutor in this case made a decision that, well, if he's going to cooperate, it's bad enough that he gave up his law license because it probably would have been taken away even if he didn't give it up, or he would have otherwise been punished. So maybe the prosecutor is looking at this saying that's a punishment enough. Do you think that could be the case, Nicole, or not?
It's possible. I mean, it is a pretty big deal. I mean, you know, anytime anybody has a license to do anything, whether it's to practice medicine or law or to be a nurse or to sell real estate, and when you have a criminal charge that turns into a criminal conviction and it completely changes the course of their life, that's a pretty significant thing. And I think that the prosecutor is sensible and fair to recognize that. It's very meaningful.
Well, you know, you got Craig Blitzer. He winds up a commercial airline pilot. And look, the last I checked, they weren't usually in the line at the soup kitchen. And his wife apparently is being allowed to continue on with this nursing path, even though there's testimony here that other people were taking exams for her. You know, I used to teach, and if one of my students was doing that and it was caught and it was clear, they were out. So are the Blitzers really paying for any of this, or do they get off so scot-free that the punishment isn't even a slap on the wrist? It's just a turn around and walk the other way?
You know, I don't know that it's so much a slap on the wrist. I mean, anytime someone falls from a public position like this one to one of disgrace, and that's exactly what's happened here, that's a pretty big punishment in and of itself. This is all very public. He's now lost his law license, which is costly to get in the first place, and it's a, you know, secure way to make a living in the future. That's eliminated. While he may be a pilot, he hasn't been a pilot for a long time. He doesn't have the seniority that he would have if he would have been doing that for his whole life. I mean, this is a huge change in the direction of this man's life at a fairly late stage in his life.
Let's go back to the testimony now of Craig Blitzer. Again, he's the cooperating witness here. He was tied up in this no-show job scheme where his wife was drawing a salary from a neighboring prosecutor while she was really taking nursing courses. He knew about it. He was involved with it. Was he really as okay with it as some people would say that maybe he was? This is a really tangled web. Again, an official corruption case out of North Carolina. The defendant, Wallace Bradsher, was the neighboring district attorney to this cooperating witness who's on the stand. We are talking about the Wallace Bradsher official corruption case in North Carolina. A series of charges wrapped up here. They all sort of fall under that heading of official corruption. And look, this is cross-examination between the defendant, who's accused of playing a role in this situation, this weird scenario, and a witness, the neighboring prosecutor who was accused of playing a role in this scenario. Nicole DeBorde is joining us from Houston, Texas. She's been monitoring this case with us. Nicole, look, you know, one thing I'm trying to unravel here, and I have to assume the jurors are doing this as well, is exactly who said what and when, because we keep hearing this phrase that, oh, you know, Cindy Blitzer, who was getting paid while going to school, when she raised questions about this, you know, why am I entering hours when I'm not working, she was told to, quote, concentrate on schooling. I'm a little bit lost as to exactly who said that and when, because if I'm following this properly, they both said it, or they're both accusing one another of saying it. Who said it?
I'm not clear either, and neither of these guys are looking like particularly good guys at this point. The whole thing just smells bad, and the more questions they ask, the madder they seem to be getting at each other. I can't imagine what these jurors must be thinking right now, besides that both of these guys are a little slimy.
Well, they could probably tell that, but are they guilty of the charges here? You know, look, Wallace Bradsher here is facing a series of charges. You've got felony obtaining property by false pretense. You've got aiding and abetting, conspiracy, 3 counts of obstruction of justice, and you've got this misdemeanor failure to discharge the duties of office. That's a pretty hefty list of charges. The last I added it up, it was a possible 18-year sentence. Is that almost too tough for this? Should it be a lighter deal? Is it going to be really hard for jurors to reach that top charge? Because at least one juror could look and say, you know what, I think the Blitzers were really driving the bus here. They're the ones who had the financial issue that led to this weird arrangement.
You know, it's hard to say what the jurors will think. And the more these witnesses go at each other, I can see these jurors getting particularly angry about these people not taking their responsibility to the public seriously. You know, on the other hand, the sentence for this charge is awfully stiff. You know, the testimony about how much money was spent on these employees, I think, is going to be critical to some of these jurors ultimately. You know, how much did this cost the taxpayers? How long did this go on? And what's the ultimate bill for what really appears to be theft, to put it in real simple terms?
Yeah, let's continue to break this case down in a bit, but we're going to take a break first. We're going to be back with some discussion again about Wallace Bradsher and also about the Gloria Williams baby snatcher sentencing that we carried for you earlier today here on Law and Crime. We'll be right back. So there was the defendant who snatched a baby from that baby's mother's hospital room, took the baby across state lines, and raised the baby as her own daughter for years. That was the sentence handed down by the judge in Florida. Nicole, what do you think? It almost looked like this defendant knew that she was going to get the book thrown at her in some regard, even though a lot of her case was that the child looks to her as mom. The child spoke up on that defendant's behalf, but you can't take away from what she took away from the child's real parents.
Oh my goodness, what a tragic story. I mean, there's just really no winning. I mean, sentencing has a variety of purposes in the criminal justice system, and one is, you know, to make sure that people don't do these kinds of things in the future. And, you know, despite the fact that this child is healthy and has been raised and loves what she thought was her mother, there's a victim here that has paid dearly with misery. And, you know, this is horrible. I can't imagine being the judge in this circumstance, but a pretty stiff sentence is probably the appropriate thing.
Yeah, look, I don't disagree with the way the judge calculated the sentence. It was up to 22 years, but the judge decided on 18 years. Well, that's exactly the length of time that that defendant had deprived the true parents of the companionship of the child that she took. So is it literally justice served? Literally.
It sure looks like it. It seems like a very thoughtful sentence on the part of the court. You know, there are no winners here. There's no way to take back those years and give these parents that child and their life back. But, you know, the sentence reflects the crime, and that's all this judge could do.
Yeah, you know, and I have to assume that there are some people sitting out there saying, look, this defendant's sob story that we heard earlier in a hearing just doesn't add up. We get that she really wanted a child of her own. We get that she had all sorts of abuse in her life and if I'm remembering it properly, had lost her own child, wanted to have a child. But her way of cleaning her life up was not to kidnap this child, Kamiyah Mobley, and raise her as her own. And there's got to be a deterrence in here.
Exactly. And that's one of the purposes of sentencing. And the judge took it into consideration and said, you know, look, you took this child away from her correct family for 18 years. And that's exactly what your sentence is now, that you'll serve in prison.
And you can't, in other words, you can't get out of it by saying, well, I did a good job as a mother to the child that I stole, because that basically was what the defendant asked for. Said, well, I was a good mom. She loves me. Things all got straightened out. In other words, no defense. The original crime was committed.
Right. I mean, the bottom line is nothing got straightened out. This is irrevocably a damaged situation. And now, not only is the family suffering and still suffering that lost this little girl, but the little girl who's grown up to an adult is going to suffer now for this woman's actions. It's a terrible, terrible thing.
Yeah, so that woman now learned her sentence, 18 years. It's basically exactly the amount of time that she deprived Kamiyah Mobley's real parents of her company, putting to an end, ultimately, when she finally came forward with the truth to that search for that baby that disappeared from a Florida hospital way back in 1998. We're going to move back to the Wallace Bradsher case. This is an official corruption case out of North Carolina that we're covering live here on the Law and Crime Network. The court took an hour-and-a-half lunch break at about 1 o'clock, so we're expecting live testimony to pick up in that case in about 10 minutes' time if they come back right on schedule. In the meantime, we're listening to some previous testimony. We are going to listen now to Cindy Blitzer. She's the woman who was the wife of one district attorney who was working for the defendant and then not working while still getting paid. Let's listen to her testimony. That was Cindy Blitzer, the co-defendant's wife in the Wallace Bradsher official corruption trial. Nicole DeBorde is still with us from Houston, Texas, breaking this down. I know you're shaking your head at this repetitively, Nicole, and I appreciate you sticking with us a little bit late because court's taking a little bit longer time to come back after break than we thought. But look, what do you make of this woman's testimony? She's going to school, and she's entering her time into the time card, and she's sitting up there on the stand saying, well, Wallace Bradsher told my husband to tell me to keep doing it. I don't know what's going through her head, because if somebody told me to do that, I wouldn't do it. I'm not working. That's not the way I do it. I either put in that I've got some approved leave or sick time or something like that. Why is she doing it? Are jurors sitting there asking the same question that I'm asking?
They have to be. I mean, this situation just keeps getting curiouser and curiouser, as they say. I mean, you are essentially, if you're this woman, a co-conspirator in theft with the DA of your county and a neighboring county. What in the world? One of whom is, of course, your husband. This can't possibly make sense if you're thinking about it clearly. And there's only one thing that they knew that they were doing, which is getting paid for not working. I can't imagine what these jurors must be thinking.
Yeah, look, and right before her testimony, they get up there and she waives her Fifth Amendment right, and basically she's not going to be prosecuted at all for part of this. Why didn't the authorities go after her?
I don't know. I don't know if it's that they hoped that they would use ultimately her testimony. I don't know what they were thinking. I'm sure they were as shocked as the rest of us. I mean, the hypocrisy of this is that these two men were responsible for meting out all kinds of judgments, essentially, about the people in their counties who they were accusing of breaking the law, all the while breaking some pretty significant laws themselves. It's really unbelievable.
So you think this should result, it sounds, if I'm reading into that statement, that you think this should result in a conviction of at least some kind. But is it worthy of 18 years and at least one felony?
That's a hard question for me. I'm not a proponent of lengthy sentences for the most part. It is true that sentences should help the rest of the people in the world know that it's not a good idea to commit these kinds of crimes. We want to prevent that from happening in the future, by example, on the one hand. On the other hand, incarcerating people costs a lot of money, not only just to keep them incarcerated, but it prevents them from earning their own keep in the world and from doing positive things. Lengthy sentences don't really help anyone. So it's...
Yeah, I think they're going to come back into session in just a couple of seconds here. The camera just started moving around in court. I can see it out of the corner of my eye here. So let's just kind of keep the ball rolling a little bit here. You've got investigators on the stand. You've got cooperating co-conspirators, alleged co-conspirators on the stand in this case. They're all pretty much repeating one another's testimony, you know, but it's pretty drawn out here. Are jurors paying attention in this? Are they just sick and tired of hearing the same thing repeated? Or are they getting lost in this because the details are sort of swimming around through the 5 or 6 different retellings of the same events that we've heard here?
You know, maybe as we sit and talk about it, maybe that's the strategy. Just numb them to all this ridiculous information. You know, I can't imagine that these jurors are thinking anything besides that none of the people in this case should ever be handling anyone else's money.
Well, I
you know,
think that's pretty clear.
Yeah,
exactly. I mean, and that's one of the things that the bar authorities would be looking at if they were looking at this case. You know, again, is it excusable that the defendant, who you're looking at live right there as the jurors filter back into the room, is it excusable that he had a small office and a ton of other things going on? Let's hold on to that because it sounds like the judge is back in session. So let's go back live to the Wallace Bradsher official corruption case in North Carolina. That phrase right there, Nicole, I guess I was confused. I wondered if the administrative office of the courts or the AOC somehow got this wrong. I guess I was confused is ringing in my ears. He was elected to the position. One would think he would know better, but he was really new. And, you know, part of me is starting to wonder if the states got this right, that this guy was new. He'd never been the elected prosecutor before. He'd been in private practice where you can pretty much set whatever rules you want for your employees. Was he relying too heavily on the neighboring DA to dictate what he should and shouldn't do?
Yeah, I mean, you almost kind of feel bad for him. I mean, he's watching something happen in the neighboring county. Why wouldn't he think, if this has been going on for some period of time, that the state's perfectly fine with this, especially if that person in the neighboring county is telling him the state is perfectly fine with this? So, you know, I can understand why he might be confused.
Exactly. And, you know, look, does that necessarily excuse it, though? Because he knew that his wife was going to school and getting paid. Should he have put a stop to it and then called out his neighboring DA to the investigators rather than wait for it to sort of spin along down the tracks?
The reality is that there's a big difference between nepotism, i.e. hiring somebody in your family to do a job, and hiring somebody who's not working and paying them. You're responsible for the taxpayer dollars when you're in public office like that. And if you've got somebody on your payroll that you know full well is not coming to work, that's a completely different thing than nepotism.
And that's one of the critical distinctions here, which is why the ethics people said that these two could basically do this wife swap. That's the phrase of the prosecutor in this case. It's not something that I made up. That's the phrase the state used to try to describe this. It's just an employment wife swap, not the other kind of wife swap. And look, Wallace Bradsher was the guy who was the supervisor. I thought that it was telling a couple of minutes ago when we heard the lead investigator say that the guy that was approving Cindy Blitzer's time cards had only one person in the office to approve, and that was Cindy Blitzer. Why wasn't one person approving everybody's time card? This was a small office. Was that a specific dodge? I'm wondering. We don't have the specific answer, but I'm wondering, what was that guy set up to somehow fail in this? And did they see through it?
Right. It looks like maybe some plausible deniability here. We have this one person who's not me signing off on the time card. That seems a little strange. The reality is that you should also, if you have one person that you're responsible for understanding what they've done work-wise and whether they showed up to work so that they should be paid for doing a job, they should know that that person's not going to get paid if they don't show up, and they shouldn't be signing off on their time card.
Okay, we're going to switch to listen to a little bit more from Craig Blitzer in just a second. But first, I want to let everybody know about an interview that's going to be coming up in just a few moments here on Law and Crime. We are expected to hear live from an attorney who is suing that defendant that everybody knows about, Casey Anthony. What's the lawsuit all about? What's it relate to? We're going to break it all down for you folks when we get that attorney on the line. What did she say that could be dragging her right back into a court of law? Is it possible that we'll see Casey Anthony getting questioned? We're going to ask all these questions. You're certainly going to want to stick around for that. But first, a little bit more from Craig Blitzer, the key witness who is the cooperating defendant in this case.